Welcome to the Advance Your Art podcast, where we talk about the journey from artist to entrepreneur and everything in between. You've worked hard to hone your craft. Now take it to the next level with tips, techniques, strategies, and routines used by successful artists to grow their businesses and careers. Now, let's get started and have some fun with your host, Yuri Cataldo.
Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. It's my pleasure. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I'd like to start off this evening by asking you how you describe yourself and what you do.
That's a really interesting question. I guess like for the majority of my life, I would say that I was a writer. And that has kind of like changed. I feel like now, like with my bio and stuff, when I have to send it out, I say like queer, activist, and storyteller. That tends to be the main label. Mm-hmm. But like on an interpersonal level, I'm also, I'm mixed, multiracial, for several generations. So that's like, queer, mixed race, activist, storyteller. It used to just be writer. And then at one point it used to just be activist. So it continues to grow.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So there's a couple different things in there that I want to get into, but let's start with the writer part. What made you want to become a writer?
I feel like I always kind of knew I wanted to be a writer. When I was a little kid, like little kids are like, I want to be a fireman, or like, I want to be a policeman, or I want to be a movie star. I think like the first profession that I remember really wanting to do was to write books. And then it changed. Like a year later, I was like, I want to be a stand-up comedian. And then I went back to, I want to write books. And it's just kind of like always stayed there, in the back of my head, even though I've had almost every job that you can possibly imagine doing. But in the back of my head, I'm like, well, this is just what's going to get me by until I finally finish, a book. And then hopefully, that will change the course. But, that's also a long shot too. Mm-hmm. So now I feel like, because I'm 35, I've gotten older, that I feel like you can always be a writer as long as you're writing, right? And as long as you like go through that process, and it kind of doesn't really matter what your day job is anymore. And I've only recently allowed myself to be like, no, screw it. You're a writer. Like you do have a book coming out and, but even if the book wasn't coming out, I would still be a writer. I'd still be a storyteller.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting definition and journey that you have just kind of described. The idea of how do you define what a writer is, even if, let's say, you're not a published author. So could you just talk a little bit more about then your journey in that? Like how long has it taken you to kind of let go of one definition into another, and how has that process been personally to you?
Yeah, so in undergrad, I actually went to school with my major had a concentration in creative writing. It was writing, linguistics, and creative writing. And then I knew I was going to an MFA program. So like that whole part of my life, my 20s, was like, I'm a writer, blah, blah, blah. And I might be, waiting tables at this Waffle House off Highway Interchange, but I'm a writer. And then after grad school, I was living in New York and I needed a job. I got involved in activism and I started working for a political organization. And because I wasn't doing any creative writing every day, I kind of started to think like, oh, well, maybe I'm not so much a writer. I did do a lot of writing, period. Like I was the digital director for like a whole year and a half. I was like a one-person digital team for this political outfit, which is kind of left of the Democrats. So I wrote all the fundraising emails. I handled all the web content, all the social media. So it was like every day I was writing to like a very large audience. At that point, at that job, our like big active email list was about 200, 300,000 people. And so I was like, well, every couple of days I like send out a fundraising email, which is kind of like the most amazing writing prompt ever. It's like, tell a story that is political in nature, that inspires people to give their credit card over the internet. And you can tell how well you're doing by how much money you raise.
Right.
So you get kind of like instant feedback.
Yeah.
And so I was like, yeah, this isn't poetry. These aren't short stories. It's not fiction. But it is still, I was like, it's close enough to writing that I can feel like, if I'm not working on the novel or the short story collection, at least I am still doing some sort of writing. And at least it's, having like a net good out there in the world. And then a lot of things happened. I think to be like super honest, like the 2016 presidential election was really rough as like somebody who worked in progressive electoral politics. And I kind of like gave my whole life over to, working in the primaries. I worked with a lot of groups closely associated with Bernie Sanders and helped raise a boatload of money for Bernie Sanders and for other progressive candidates. I also, did a lot of local organizing around New York City area, and just got like completely beat down. And it's probably not the most, polite thing to say as somebody who like works in activism and really cares about like the movement for justice and liberation. But I got burnt out super hard, and I had to take like a long, hard look at myself afterwards. It was like, you basically worked like over a year of 7 days a week, 13 to 15 hours every day, ignored your family, ignored your personal life. My health went to crap. And at the end of it, what did we get? And like, we got the Trump election. And so I was like, well, it might be time to put this activist hat off for a little bit and, pick up the writer one again. And I feel like I saw that a lot within like my social circle around New York, with a lot of people sort of like going back to their roots after the election of like, what is the thing that sustains me? What is it that I'm really trying to do or feel like I'm called to do versus like, what is this thing that I'm doing day in, day out? Because I think for lots of people, the 2016 election was a wake up call. And for me, especially, I wasn't like, I wasn't at Hillary Clinton's campaign office or Bernie Sanders for that matter, but I was like, adjacently kind of close. And it was still a major wake up call for me to be like, let me go back to the roots of who I am as a person. And that's the only way that I feel like I can continue to live healthy.
Right. So how has that then realization affected your writing now and what you do for a living?
So that's interesting. So I left that job, the like super demanding, terrible job. But, I was also able to get, a good bit of time off, from like working overtime for basically an entire year straight. I had like a solid month of paid time off in New York City. And instead of going anywhere, I just like stayed in my apartment and finished my short story collection. I had done about half of it when I was in grad school. I graduated in 2013. And so for like 3 years, I kind of just sat on it and built up my day job career. But once I had like the time off, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like throw all the mashed potatoes on the wall and like just like shut myself in and just write like every day. And if it's good, if it's bad, it doesn't matter. I'll look at it later. But just like get it out all on the page. And then my job, I have like several jobs, but my day job and my like secondary day job involve a lot of travel. So after the election and after that time off, I was like, oh wow, I have like a good chunk of like what is a manuscript. But then I had to go on the road and do all these other things. So whenever I found myself like alone in a hotel room, sometimes when traveling, you're like, oh, I'm in this town. I don't know anybody. Like, let me go out to a bar or like whatever. And I started just like locking myself into the hotel room of like, I have no other outside distractions. I'm just going to turn my laptop on and start editing and, like adding, subtracting to the different stories, pushing them around in different ways. And then that kind of has become my habit. I tend to have to travel for work about once a month, and I get to the airport like super early and find my spot and pop open my laptop or more and more my phone. I've been like experimenting with doing creative writing on my phone. And will just like write while I'm at the airport, and write while I'm flying, and like write at the hotel. And that's like, I read that, who was it? Maya Angelou, back when she was alive, that she would like rent out a hotel for like a week and just sort of like lock herself in there and write in complete isolation. And that's like sort of slowly becoming the same thing that I'm doing. I remember when I read that about her, I was like, oh, that's so cool and interesting. I wish I had the money to do that.
Right.
And now I'm like, maybe I can like trick my jobs into sending me places for work so I can have that excuse to do that.
Yeah.
Without having to pay for it. I think there is something about isolation though, sort of removing yourself away from things and trying to find the opportunities in life to really take a step back.
Mm-hmm. There's one person that I know who will purposely book flights from New York to like Tokyo, round trip flights, and will write all the way on the plane there, have sleep for a little bit, and then fly back and then finish editing his book.
That's amazing.
So maybe you just need to get your company to send you a little bit further, and then you could just isolate yourself on an airplane for 8 hours at a time.
Yeah, Sydney, Australia, here I come.
Yeah, exactly. So with you, what you're currently working on, your short story collection, what did you notice about your writing when you were doing it in 2013 versus your writing in 2017?
Oh my gosh, a whole bunch. And then, so my collection is actually like 50% of the stories were written in 2013, the bulk of them, and then the other 50% were written in the weeks after the election. So, and I feel like you can kind of tell because the ones written right after the election are very inherently political. And also, like, you know, like my political ideology, I've always been kind of like a liberal progressive person, but working within progressive politics really sort of like sharpened or honed my political ideology and, you know, how I'm able to articulate that, especially, you know, working for like several years, being the writing voice of a progressive political organization. So like, you know, just the ways that I would talk about income inequality and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I was super nervous actually about the stories that I wrote in 2013 because those like my like pre-woke years. So I like went back and like really looked at like how all these characters are portrayed and like what are some of the like maybe underlying like stereotypes or assumptions that I had then that needed to be challenged. Mm-hmm. And you know, I think I tend to do a pretty good job with that anyway, but I think it's always good to like look back. Another writing professor had told me, well, there's that saying, especially for like nonfiction, which is like to wait 7 years and then write things down so you have like the space and the time to get away from it. And it seemed like 3-4 years was actually a really healthy distance from that first half of the collection of like coming back to those stories and actually being very objective of like, you know, how are women portrayed in your story? And like, if it was a movie, would it pass that like Leadville test? Like, do two women have names? Do they talk to each other about something other than a man? Like, does that happen in your story? And, and if not, why not? And, so it was a lot easier to do that because I wasn't as close to that material. And I think some of the new material, I made sure that, and I feel like this is going to be like a weird thing that I will do with my bodies of writing going forward, is that I don't think people really understand how elections work if you've never really worked on them, like as a campaign manager or deputy campaign manager. So I have a short story that is just about working on an election. And it's not a fun, happy story.
Right, I can imagine so.
They often aren't fun and happy experiences. But I think that like it kind of changes how you think about democracy.